Hi everyone, it's Lolita and this is the video for the values and shape projects that we're working on for our design class. Hope you enjoy. So we're going to start this project by making our grid for our value chart on the 11 by 15 paper. I want you to put a mark at the halfway point on the long side, the 15-inch side. So we're going to make a mark at the halfway point. So half of 15 is 7.5. Make a little mark on that 7.5-inch side and twist your paper around, and we're going to make another mark corresponding on the other side for 7.5 at 7.5-inch mark. Then we take our ruler and we're going to draw a line all the way across the paper. Okay, we'll start at this side and come all the way here. Okay, so I've subdivided the paper. I've got 7.5-inch on this side, 7.5-inch on this side. So I'm going to use one of the sides to make my value chart. Okay, so here we go. Let's check this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, because this is for our design project, I know that I'm trying to make two 2-inch by 10-inch rectangles. The top one I'm going to use for the step value chart, and then the second one I make I'm going to use for the gradient chart. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my ruler and I'm going to line it up on the side of the paper again, and I'm going to start my first mark 1 inch down, and that's going to be the top boundary for my grid, for my value chart grid for the step value. And then I'm going to make another tick mark down here at the 3-inch mark, because that gives me 2 inches. And then I'm going to put a 1-inch space between my two grids. So I'm going to start the other one at 1 inch away from the bottom line where I intend to make the grid. Then I'll just go measure down 2 inches, and now I've got another one at the 6-inch mark there, so 2 inches down. Then I'm going to go to the other side of the corresponding paper and make the corresponding mark, so this way I am going to be able to draw those all the way across. All right, so I'm going to start again 1 inch down. Take this and line it up right there with the edge of the paper. You want to use that mark right there at the 0, not at the end of the ruler, okay? So I'm going to go down 1 inch, and if I put a tick at that 1 where the number 1 is, that means I've gone from 0 to 1, and that's 1 inch. So now I'm going to go from 1 to 3, and that's going to be 2 inches, and I'm going to put another tick mark there. Remember, I said I was going to put 1 inch in between my two grids, my two value charts, my gradient and my step. All right, and then I'm putting one at the 4 mark and another one at the 6 mark. I know that I want this to be 10 inches across, and because this is an 11-inch paper, then what that's going to allow me to do, it's going to allow me to put a 1 inch, I've got 1 inch left over out of, because I know I need 10 inches, and 11 minus 10 is 1. So I'm going to put a little tick mark at 1/2 inch so I make it nice and pretty. Then I'm going to put another corresponding down here at the bottom here. I'm going to put corresponding tick marks again at the 1/2 inch point. And so I'm going to go 1/2 inch in from the side of the paper, put a little tick mark, 1/2 inch in from the side, this side of the paper, and put a little tick mark. So that's where that edge of my bounding box for my value chart is going to be, is on this line. So I can move in here and I'm just going to make a nice little line all the way down here, from here to here. So I've got myself, and that's going to be the edge of my bounding box for my little value charts. And I'm going to make another one here. And then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to join these lines up. And so I've got my top bounding box, and this is going to be for my step value chart. And I'm going to take that all the way over to that edge and take this all the way over to this edge. And that's my top bounding box. It's 2 inches by 10 inches. And then I've got my second one here. And this is also going to be 2 inches by 10 inches. And this is for your gradient value chart. So let's take that there and line it up with the tick marks that I made. And there we go. I'll start at the line here and move it back over to here. So there. Now I've got 2 boxes. I've got one for my step value chart and one for my gradient chart. Now what I can do is I can clean these lines up here if I want. It's not necessary for this particular project, but you can go back in and erase those out if you want. I'm not going to bother with it here, but if you want to, you guys can go back in yours and erase those excess lines out if you don't want them on your paper. You can go back in and take those off. You can take your tick marks off. So there, I've got 2 boxes, and now on the top one I'm going to divide that into 5 2-inch boxes. So I'm going to do that same process where I go to the end, either end, and I'm just going to put tick marks at every 2 inches. So I'm lining my 0 up with the edge of my bounding box for my value chart. And so I'm going to put 1 tick mark at 2, 1 at 5, 4, 1 at 6, 1 at 8, and then obviously I already have the other one at 10, and I'm going to go to the top of the box and do that same process all over again. Put 1 tick mark at, let me move that over just a little, okay, 1 tick mark at 2, what on earth? Okay, so I'm going to put 1 tick mark at 2, 1 tick mark at 4, 1 tick mark at 6, 1 tick mark at 8, and then I've got my other one. All right, I had put them on at the wrong place. So let's go. And I'll put 1 tick mark here at 2. Now they line up visually correctly. 1 at 4, 1 at 6, and 1 at 8. This is what I get for thinking I'm too clever with my videos. So it's going to be the outside line. I'm going to erase that wrong mark that I made in there so I don't confuse myself when I line them up. So I didn't slide my ruler over. I thought I had, but when I double checked, I saw that it was off just by a fraction. So then there's 1 2-inch square, 2 2-inch squares, 3 2-inch squares, and 4 and 5 I make simultaneously. That's going to be great. Okay, here we go. And there it is. This box we're going to leave just plain because we're going to do a gradient in that box. So now what we want to do is we want to label these 1 through 5. So where 1 is going to be white, 2 will be a light gray, 3 will be a mid-tone gray, 4 will be a dark gray, and 5 is going to be black. So I'm going to just put black there and put white here. And with the white, what you want to do is you don't put any paint in it at all. You're just going to leave it white with the white of the paper. So what I'm going to do here is, since I've already got my white in, I'm going to put in my black. So this way I've got my white and my black squares resolved, and I'm going to have them rendered in painted. So what we want to do is you want to take a nice clean brush. I recommend either using your number 6 or your number 4. A lot of students like to use the 10 brush, the flat brush, but I recommend using your round. I'm going to use my round, and I'm not going to insist that you use your round, but I do want you to get more familiar with using your round. They're more versatile than the flat brushes. It seems somewhat intuitive to fill in a square with a flat brush, but it's just as effective to fill it in with a round brush. So what we want to do here is, these are pans, and so this is our nice little koi set, the koi watercolors, the Sakura koi, that I had you guys get in your kit. Yes, this video is for my design class, and anyone else in the whole wide world is welcome to watch the video too, but for my design students, I had you guys get this in your kit. And so what you're going to do is you're going to wet one of your brushes. I recommend wetting the number 6 brush because it's going to hold a decent amount of water. And you want to just take that clean water and dab it onto the black in the pan, and then you want to drip it onto the white in the pan too. And what we're doing here is, these paints are dry and we need to get them wet first. So I'm getting them wet, and then we're going to work them up and put them and make little puddles of paint, and then we're going to transfer it from the palette over here to the paper. You don't want to transfer it from your little pen. You always want to work it up nice and find your consistency that you're looking for in your palette. So that's when you become expert painters, you can decide whatever process you want, but because we're just learning now, we're going to go with this process because it's going to be the most effective for you. Now what I've got here is, I've got all of my brushes that were in my kit, the flat, the large, a medium, and a small round brush. It's a 6, a 4, and a number 1 that are in the Winsor Newton Cotman series that I also put in your guys' kit, had you guys get in your kit. So now what we want to do is, let's go ahead and mix up some of the black. You'll also notice over here, I've got 2 containers of water. I need 1 container for my clean water and 1 container for dirty water, because you need to wash your brushes off and you don't want to take your dirty water and then contaminate your paints with the dirty water. So here's my clean water, and I'm going to transfer this black over to this little well here in my palette. And this is a little bit of a tedious process, but bear with the process and it's going to treat you really well eventually. And what you see here, you see me getting paint out of the little pan, and then I'm transferring it into this well over here. I'm going to scrape it over here on the side of my palette, so that way I get some of the paint deposited into the well and off of the brush. Let me get more of it here, and this is just taking that pigment from that pan and working it over here. So now I want to get some of that paint out of my brush. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just drip some clean water over it with one of my other brushes to coax some of that paint out, so I don't put all of that paint down into my water, because I like to get my supplies to stretch as far as I can. So I'm going to clean that brush off though, and I'm going to be using my number 6 brush to paint in this 5 black over here. And you see I mixed up a fair amount here in this well, and I'm going to recommend that you guys mix up this quantity too, since you're going to be working with the same kit as I am, or if you're not, just sort of eyeball it. It looks like it's almost a 2-inch square. Let's see, what is it? It's a rectangle though. So that's about 2 inches and by 1 3/4. So you see what size the puddle is. You can look at it and see the viscosity of the puddle that I've mixed up. It's a little more viscous than water, but not quite as viscous as a maple syrup. So let's take this, and if you want, this half of the paper you're going to be using for a test drive. So if you want, if you're not quite ready to commit to your painting in your square, and when you paint in your square you want to stay in the lines, because remember, this is a value and shape exercise. So we've got where we're not creating an image, but we're just making a nice little exercise where we stay in the lines and start building our watercolor skills. So if you want to test what your value of your paint looks like before you put it in your, commit it to your square, that's what this side is for. And then we're going to take this side and we're going to do some test driving for it later. So here we go. I'm just putting a little black down there. That looks pretty solid. So look, I'm going to put it in my number 5 square, my black. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paintbrush and I'm going to put it right up there against the line of my square. And you see I sort of choked up on my brush. A lot of videos that you watch with watercolor, they're going to tell you to hold the brush back here. But because we're working in such a little controlled space, I'm going to go ahead and choke up on my brush a little. And now what you want to do is try to work where you're doing one full stroke all the way across. You can move down with, and you can move your paper around. So I'm just going to move this here without getting into my, putting my hand into my black paint, and move this wet paint while it's still wet. Just, I'm going to move it down just a little bit here on that side to keep it really nice and clean on those lines. And again, I'm going to take this while it's all still nice and wet and just move it down there really nice. And what I'm paying special attention to is that I make sure that I keep these edges what I call active, and basically you just want to make sure they're wet, and then you're just going to take your brush and do your next stroke and butt it right up against the edge that you just laid down, and that wet paint, it'll just smoothly integrate into your next stroke that you laid down. So I'm just pulling that down again so that way I'm staying in the lines. Then I'm putting, I always like to keep a paper towel underneath my hand, and I do that to keep the oil from my hands off my paper, and it keeps me, my workspace and my paper really nice and clean as I go. So this is, I'm just going to pull a little bit more of this down to keep that line really nice and clean there. So, and you see that I've got a really nice tip on my number 6 brush. I'm going to just take, and even a little bit of water, because even in this amount of time, it starts drying up a little bit, my little puddle here. So that's nice and wet still, so I'm going to take my brush and just put it right up against that edge, put that there, put it right up against that edge, And so I get really nice solid coverage because I am working into that live edge, into that wet area. So I'm going to pull that paint down. And you see, I'm not pulling it down too far. I'm keeping it nice and controlled. If I pull it down too far, I'm not going to be able to paint that area in the amount of time that it would take for the paint to dry and form a hard edge. So I've got it, it's still nice and wet. I'm going to take that paint and introduce it right into that edge, and look how nice and resolved that black is getting. And you see that I'm moving my paper around. I'm not keeping my paper static in one place. I'm moving it around to give myself the best advantage I have at accessing and using the rotation, the natural rotation of our tools, our hands, our wrists. So here I know that edge is still wet. I feel fairly confident that I can make those two edges meet, so I'm just going right up to that edge, and I'm pushing my brush down just a little, and you can see that it is in fact, joining up with that live edge there. So I'm just taking this here, and because I'm working those delicate little corners, and I want to make sure that I keep my paint in the lines, I'm applying it very steadfastly, and I've choked up on the brush even more to give myself more control. So now I've got my black finished. I know I've got my white finished already because I didn't have to put anything in it. So now I'm going to take this and put a little bit more of this paint down in here and wash my brush off. And now I've got my dirty water, and I'm going to move these brushes over here, y'all. So I've got my dirty water, and I've cleaned my brush off. And what I'm going to do before I stick this into the white and start adding white paint to my black paint, I'm going to make sure that my brush is nice and clean. I'm going to get all of that black out of my brush because I don't want to ever contaminate my other paints. Not with my black, I don't want to contaminate when we get into color. Wouldn't even want to contaminate my yellow with a green. So, and that's another reason we pull them out and put them over here, because you're going to be less likely to have a really awful work surface. So that looks like it's rubbing clean. You guys see how that works, where now it's just the clear water. So I'm going to go, I feel comfortable enough to go back into my clean water because my brush is clean. Look at that, comes to a nice beautiful point, and you can see it just runs really clear. So I'm going to pull out some of the white paint now. I'm going to rotate my palette here, and just to give myself better access to the white paint. And I'm going to do that same process that I did with the black paint. I'm going to do that with the white paint. And I'm just going to pull that out and put that over in this well over here. And you see how it's all nice and loaded up in my brush. And I'm doing that same thing where I'm going to take some of that pigment and scrape it off of my brush and down into the well by so I'm going to put a little bit more water in here, and so just getting a little more of that pigment out, again, just by physical means. And I'm going to wipe this out and wash it off in the dirty water, and again, make sure that it's not dirty and all the pigment has come out. And I'm going to stick that back in my clean water because I need a little bit more water in my white pigment in order to get as much paint over into this well as I need for mixing up. So here we go, that's looking pretty good. So you'll notice that these tend to, it's like they shrink up that is an effect that will go away after about a week of using your palette more. So when you get new plastic palettes, they tend to get a little, they're, they don't quite, I'm, I'm a little distracted pushing this off. So they're not always really broken in, if you will, and so they tend to repel the paint, but after a while it won't have that repelling action anymore because you'll have worn off. There's probably some type of like little protective coating on the surface that it does come off at some point. So I'm just going to mix a gray over in here in this middle palette, and I'm going to mix something somewhere in between the black and the white. And so I'm just taking some of the white that I have over here, my pure white that I have over here, and I'm depositing it from this well over into this well. And I'm checking physically my brush here too. Some of that pigment had got a little too piled up on that brush. And so I'm gonna clean that off again. Then I'm gonna take some of this black paint here and I'm gonna mix it into this well. And I'm gonna try to come up with a value that is somewhere in between, halfway in between black and white. And I think I'm gonna use this this brush and put a little bit more white in and then clean that off. Then I'm gonna take a little bit of my dirty water because it's okay because I've got only the two pigments in there. I've only got the gray and the black in there. So I'm not going to get these stray colors in there suddenly. It's just the two colors that we've been working with, or the two values that we've been working with, and so we can feel fairly confident that we're not going to get any kind of random tones or hues in here in our grays that we don't really want. So that looks somewhat halfway in between. And if you want, what you can do is you can look at that Denman-Ross scale that I put in the canvas lesson. I'm going to take a little bit more of that water and add it in here because that was getting a little on the thick side. And what I'm doing here is, the reason I'm mixing the one in between is because this number 5 over here is still a little bit wet. So I'm going to go over here into my number 3 square because I'm not quite ready to do the number 4. Or maybe I think what I'll do is I'm going to jump all the way over to the number 2. So this way, by the time I do number 2, that number 5 is going to be dry enough for me to go back in. So I'm going to take this brush where I had mixed up my number 3 value, and I'm going to take that and put it into the white. And that right there is getting me that, just about that light gray that I'm interested in having. I'm going to take a little bit more water and add it to this mix, and that's going to be wonderful. And I've got this mixed here already, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to start painting my number 2 square. Let me do this before I go forward with it. I'm going to erase that extra tick mark that I had in there, push all of that debris off. And I'm going to do that for my number 3 square too, because the pencil mark will definitely show through a value that's lighter than it. So you want to make sure, if you don't want to see your pencil marks, you got to make sure to erase them. We don't worry about the ones in between, not for this exercise, but when you do a drawing, when we get to some of our designs and you do a drawing and you don't want those lines in your watercolor, remember to always erase what you don't want showing up in your final design. Make sure you erase those lines out, because if you paint over them with a value that's lighter than them, that you won't be able to go back in and erase them. So get rid of them, any excess marks like I had here. So I'm going to go in and do that same process that I did for the number 5, our black, and I'm going to take my brush and just take it right up to the line, the boundaries of my number 2 box, and do that same process. Pull that paint down just a little, so that way I've got a nice clean line there, and I'm not going to pull it down too far, more than I know, again, where the paint would dry before I got a chance to fill in that little space. So you don't want to do too much scrubbing back and forth. You want to just do some nice, beautiful, even strokes across. So again, where I'm going in and I'm just going to pull that wet paint, that live edge, I'm calling it. I'm going to pull that down just slightly, work into that live edge. This paint is, rather the paper, it is student grade, so it is piling up just a little. So just be aware that it will do that. And if you feel like you physically can go back in and pull your paint and move it around without disturbing the surface too much, go ahead and go back in. But for the most part, you don't really want to go back in an area that you've already painted until that paint dries. And once it dries, you can do another layer over it. So you see here also, I've got control of my brush where I am using it to do that edge, and I didn't really need to move my paper around too much this time. So there's that, and this is wet here too, so I'm just gonna take that and just finally go along that and pull that paint out all the way to the edge. And then I've got myself nice, beautiful, clean lines, real crisp edges, and I'm gonna let that dry. While that's drying, I'm gonna go back in and I'm gonna mix my number 4 paint. And my number 4 paint is gonna be somewhere between black and this dark gray. So since I've already got all of this paint on my brush and I've got this black here, and I know I'm not going to be using the black again for this section, I'll pull it back out, or maybe so I'm just going to mix that white right into this black, so that way I've got myself just about a number 4. I'm going to make sure that it's darker than black and lighter than this mid-tone here. I'm going to add a little bit more white in there because it looks like it's a little darker than I want. So I'm going to add some of that gray tone that I have left over from my number 2 and add that in. And now I've got something that's definitely lighter than black, and it's definitely darker than that number 3 next to it. So that looks terrific. And I'm going to do that same process again, where I take my brush and I'm going to go right up to, hi Ricky boy. I don't know if you guys can see my kitty cat over there, my big boy cat named Ricky. Hi sweetheart. So here we go. I'm going to take that right up to that line and lay that down right next to my black. I think I probably could have gone a little lighter with this, but I'm also relatively happy with it. So let's go. I've made the commitment. I could have tested it down here next to this black if I wanted to, and I suppose I could have, but I didn't, and it's a little teeny tiny darker than I want, but I still think it's going to look pretty good. I think it'll look halfway in between black and then that number 3. So I'm doing that same thing where I'm going to go ahead and pull that down, the edge down, pull that edge down so I've got nice clean lines. And you see now that that black is dry, I can take that right up and butt it right up against the edge of the black, and that black isn't going to bleed over into that section. So I've got that live edge, that wet edge still. So I'm just going to feed that edge, and just feed that right into that wet edge. And you see I'm just pulling it over with one nice stroke. That's what you want to try to work at, is you don't want to go back and forth and do scumbling. You want to just get yourself a really nice stroke. And again, you see I'm choked up on my brush to have a sense of control. And I missed that edge, but look, I got it back in there. Woo! Saved. All right, so we're going to, there we go. And then I'm just going to take this in here really nice and controlled and draw that really nice crispy edge there. Okay, look, that is wonderful, right? Look at that. Okay, and you want to try to get like each little square as fully resolved with the value. You want to try to get it homogeneous even. So you want it even, consistent from one side to the next, from top to bottom. You want it to be just this nice, even little field of color. And now what we're going to do is we're going to wait just a little while for the number 4 and the number 2 to dry, because if I were to put my paint in there now, it would run in. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take advantage of this time, because we're on this other half, we're going to do what I like to call take our brushes for a test drive. And so what I want you guys to do is just draw some random shapes. So I'm a big fan of hearts, so I'm going to draw a heart, you know, maybe draw like a leaf shape. So I'll draw a leaf, just some random leaf. So there's just a leaf shape. Maybe do a circle. All right, that's a pretty good circle. Maybe do a star. And so we are drawing shapes because we want to fill in the shape. And you could also just play around and make some random shapes even without actually drawing them in first. And what I want you to do here, and you can do it while that paint dries. It doesn't matter if this is upside down relative to that. It's fine, because now I want you to take your brushes for a test drive, and you've got plenty of paint mixed up here, because you've already mixed up enough paint to make sure that you fill in that you have enough paint to fill in each one of the little squares. And you get a little bit of practice from having filled in your black, and you saw how far the paint goes, and it'll give you an idea of how to gauge how much paint you need to mix up to make sure you have enough. So what we want to do here, just see what your brushes do. And I'm going to go ahead and wet my my flat brush here. Clean it out a little more. Okay, wet it with my nice clean water. And I'm just going to take this paint. It doesn't matter which color you take, but I'm just going to go ahead and take some of this. And I'm going to see what my brush can do. So you want to see, like, maybe how long the paint will last by just doing one stroke, how far you can get before your brush runs out of paint. And that did pretty good, but we can see that it's not the same value from one edge to the next, and you can use that information to your advantage. You can, like, find effects that you get serendipitously and then use them intentionally. So now, that was using the broad side of the brush. Now, I'm going to use the thin side of the brush, and with that same flat brush where I made this almost half-inch mark, is that a half-inch mark? Yeah, so it's almost a half inch mark, maybe 3/8 I think is what it is. So a 3/8 inch mark. Let's see, I can get a really skinny mark out of this brush too by using the skinny flat side. So I'm right next to it. Look at that. So see what I can do with the same brush. I can get different marks from it. Play around, you know, look at maybe the gestures you get from the brush. And so I'm also going to take advantage of this time to, I know I'm going to be needing some more black paint because I'm going to be doing a gradient value chart down there. So I'm going to just get some more black out while I wait for that paint to dry. It's it's getting a little dry, but I know I need some solid black paint in the meantime, so I'm going to get that out. Again, you see how I'm knocking some of it out of my brush by rubbing it up against the side instead of just putting it all back into that water. It saves your paint and it also saves your water, so you don't have to make as many trips as you otherwise might have. So you see I'm putting more clean water in there, working up that surface of the paint. And it's almost like just petting that surface, painting it. And that fills my brush up. And I'm just going to take that in again and just deposit it into this little well. And you can see that, again, another nice way to get it off of your brush is to just rub it up against the side. So I've got that black paint now. And since it's on my brush, I might as well use it to play around and see if I can paint one of these shapes with my brush. See if I can manipulate this flat brush into doing a circular shape. And it looks like I can. So, and again, it's like you see me choking up on my brush, and that's for when I'm looking for control. When you're just going for gesture, like you can do some really, you don't have to choke up on that brush. You can hold it back like this, really nice and loose, and just really let the paint flow. But for this particular exercise, we are using a little sense of control. So you can also play with the idea of what we were doing here is called wet and to dry because we were working with the media, the wet paint, and putting it on a dry surface. You can also work wet into wet where you take one value or one color and drop it into an area that's already wet, and you'll see how that will disperse. You can also just take a brush and, like, if you want to get a really nice random diffuse, you can wet that whole area, the whole shape. I'm going to lift some of that water up with my brush because it got a little too wet. And then you can just dab paint in there and see where it'll run. See where it goes. You can play with it that way. And just see where it randomly runs. You can also do a little wet into wet and be more deliberate about applying the paint. So this is what will happen is I painted in that little leaf shape, and the paint's only going to go where the water is, because with watercolor, that is the only place that the paint goes, is where there's water. If the surface is not wet, the paint will not move over it. So you see you can move the paint around and get yourself some nice little values this way. Playing with that value structure using the wet paint that's already in there by virtue of that water. And so that's what a wet on wet technique is going to do for you. So I want you guys to play more. I want you to think about like maybe writing your name with the brushes. So play with each of your brush. Look at what your number 4 can do. Look at what your number 2 can do. See what's the skinniest line you can make perhaps. Maybe see what the fattest line is with that brush. And it's going to help inform you when you need to find certain areas when you get into doing your design. It'll let you know which brush is going to be the right tool for the job. So this way you don't go into a little area with a big brush, and perhaps you don't go into a big area with a little brush. So this is another way you can work wet into wet, and this is basically the technique we're going to be using when we do our gradient. So I'm going to turn this back around, and those are dry enough that I can paint my number 3 in. So here's my number 3, but what I am going to do this time, I am going to put this down next to, okay, put it down next to that. And I feel it's almost light enough, so I'm going to, but I want to add just a little more white. So I'm going to steal some of this gray from over in the palette in the little well next to it, just to make it just a little bit lighter. And since that paint's already wet, I might as well take some of it. So then I'm going to go over here. I always bundle my little papers up. I'm going to unfold that now, and I'm going to go ahead and go in here and do that same process where I go with my paint right up next to the line, and with my paintbrush, got that nice little tip going. I'm going to pull some of that paint down physically. The paper is warping just a little bit now. That is the nature of watercolor paper. And especially with this weight, this is just 140-pound cotton. Looks like I didn't quite have that area down there as dry as I should have. So then, again, just moving that down back to the weight of the paper. That's the thickness. There are thicker watercolor papers with higher weights, and those won't warp as much. So, but this is just a good economical paper that we're using here. So I'm, again, just pulling that paint down, re-wetting my brush because I can see that I'm running out of pigment on my brush. Take that right into that live edge and get that square completed in one solid value. Again, taking that right up to the edge of that square. This might bleed in a little because that edge is wet. So I'm just moving that paint around just a little. All right. And that's, you know, again, the paper's warped. So there's a couple things I'd like to start with in terms of studio practices and best studio practices. With your brushes, you want to make sure that you never, ever, ever, ever leave your brushes sitting in the water. Never leave your brushes sitting in the water. That will damage them. And the damage is that the brushes will act, the handle of the brush will act like a sponge. It acts like a sponge because it's made of wood, and it just absorbs that water down, or rather up into it. And then you'll find that the paint will start cracking off of your handle. And this is, I lent my brush to a student once, and it came back like this, so I can use it. I mean, they're still usable, but over time this is really going to deteriorate, and this will cut into your fingers. So don't leave your brushes in the water. Over time it'll really damage them. The second thing I want to make you aware of is that you don't have to toss your paints out. You don't have to clean your palettes out after you're finished painting. You can go ahead and let them dry right there in your palette. I've already activated these again in my palette, so you can see that they're nice and wet. So I've got another palette here that I've been using in my classroom, and I'm just going to put some water into the little wells here, and you're going to see that that paint that has dried up and is in the bottom of my palette there, it can just be reactivated, and that's one of the beauties of watercolor. So throughout this project, you guys, you don't need to clean up your palettes at all. In fact, I mean, if they make too big of a mess where you can't possibly function with them and you need to mix up a new value, then, you know, by all means, take a little bit of that off, sacrifice it. But for the most part, what you're going to find is you'll just be able to modify that with any given adjustment. You can add more solid black in, you can add more solid white in. And when we get into color, you're going to see that the same is going to be true with working with watercolors and color also. So just keep that in mind, that you don't have to clean your palettes up. You can, in fact, it's sometimes just an advantage to have values that are already pre-mixed for you. So all you have to do is just activate them, and you don't have to go through that whole mixing process that we've already looked at. So with that in mind, let's get right on to going over here, and I'm going to do a gradient wash in this area here. So I'll be right back. All right, I'm going to move this one out of the way since that's got a different brand of paints in it. And I want you guys to understand that it's okay to hold your paper and like work with it at a slight level or angle rather, and let gravity do a little bit of work with you. That's a really good way to work with watercolors, is let gravity work with you. Our tendency is going to be working with it flat, and some people will say that that's not the way to work, but sometimes it's the only option you have, and it's okay to work with it flat, but you can try to give it a little bit of an incline. You can even use your watercolor pad with the surface that you're working on and give it a little tilt that way, and that's about a 20-degree tilt. And let's go ahead and work with it that way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this around, because we're going to work from white to black. You can work from black to white, you can work from white to black. That really winds up being your preference in this particular exercise, but you might find it easier to work with white to black because it might be easier to switch values, because you'll always be adding extra black and you won't have to clean your brush quite as much. And when we get into some of our color designs, we'll talk about whether or not it makes sense to work from dark to light or light to dark, and I'll be explaining why. So for the moment, what I'm going to do is start this gradient value chart at this end, and I'm going to just leave this in blank because that's white, and starting at almost at about a quarter down, I'm going to wet the paper just with some clear water, and then I'm going to add in a little bit of the lightest value that I have mixed up, and I'm going to just start adding that in right at about the halfway point, or where I left off with my water. It'll diffuse a little bit into that white, into the water. And this is getting a little too watery, so what I'm going to do is just brush some of that excess paint off of my brush, so that way I can start controlling the flow of my paint again. Then I'm just going to add more of that light value I have mixed up into there. I'm just taking a light side to side motion, trying not to exceed the lines. You can see here when I get to the end of my line, I can just pull that paint down a little bit, and as long as I maintain that bead or that live edge, I'm going to be okay with adding more paint into it and not having a hard edge. So I'm just going to take a little bit of this dark paint I have here and dip it a little bit into the lighter paint and start working on that idea of transition. I can just see the visual response here. Just looking, I probably could have gotten more of a gradual transition between these two values. By the time I get all the way down to the bottom of my square number 2, I want to be painting a value that is the same tone as my completed square number 2. I'm going to go ahead and lift some of that water right there and my pigment mixture. I'm going to add a little bit of this extra pigment over here on the side. All right, now I'm just going to add that right into that live edge down there, the bottom of that bead. Keep going, and add more. And now we're moving to about the same value as my number 2 square. And I'm going to finish that number 2 square with the number 2 value. And then I'm going to start moving into this third value I have over here. And I'm just going to combine those values. You see that I still have the majority of the mixture is still that dark value. So I'm just getting some transitional values between these two little pots of color I got mixed up here. So I'm putting that down into the wet edge. Putting that down into the wet edge. And I'm getting myself a nice little transition here. Okay, look at that. All right. And now I'm going to get into the darker tone and start applying that here. And into the darker tone and apply that here. And then I have my number 3 there. And that ends about at the same level as my number 3. That's nice and wet there. What you guys should do is mix up all of your values before. I only mixed black, but what I'm going to do here is just, and you can do this if you feel like you've got that skill already. So I'm just taking a little bit of the solid black I have here and doing just a real quicker spontaneous mix, adding a little bit of black into that gray that I had mixed up. And I'm just going to brush that into the paper here, paint the paper. And that's going to give me, I'm going to move this just physically down a little bit more to, then I'm going to stroke a little bit back to get a little bit more of a transition in between those two levels. I think I got a little too dark in there. Let me move that back up a little lighter. And then let me have that slide down. Okay. Slide down. And I'm just stroking that in there now with that new value that I've mixed up. That is a transition into value number 4. Just putting that in there. I have just that nice little slant going, so that way gravity works on my side and the paint moves down and the two values will diffuse into each other a little more nicely. I want a slightly darker value, so I'm going to go ahead and take some of this dark value I have here and mix it in with this super dark value I've put over here on the corner. And look at that, that's about my number 4. And I'm going to start working that into my gradient. Then dip right back into that area and paint the sides of my rectangle. Okay, really nice. And then all the way down, start going into my number 5 area. And I can start adding a little bit more of black to my painting. Adding that black. And then I'm going to wash my brush off here at the end and dip it into the clean water because I can tell that my paint had dried up a little, and then I've got my black and I'm going to paint in my black, solid black down to the end, and that's going to make a really nice gradient with a transition. I'm going up those sides and giving myself a nice outline and going back in and painting that, the end of that gradient. All right, so that's a nice little gradient that we've got there, you guys. I'm gonna let that dry, and while it dries, I'm going to mix up a little bit more paint. I'm gonna let that dry, and we'll cut back to painting a little bit more of the test drives for the brush when we get back. I'm gonna let that dry flat. I'm going to play with this area down here just a little more before I finish up this portion of the project. I'm going to play a little bit with my number 4 brush. I always like to wet them, and this way I can control the amount of moisture I have in my brush every single time. That is what we're trying to do here, is to control all of these tools here, figure out how to use them to our advantage. So what I'm going to do with this heart here is a little bit of a wet into wet. I had done it with the leaf before, but I'm going to be a little bit more deliberate about this one, moving around that heart, looking at just how much moisture I put down. And I'm going to let that soak into the paper just for a little while. Just let that soak in there, because I really want that surface to pull that down. And while I'm waiting for that to soak in there just a little, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in with I'm going to wet this up really nice, and that looks like a good viscosity. Again, remember, you want it much more loose than syrup and much thicker than water. So just going in, I'm going to see how I can control and maybe just outline where I've already put a line here, and I'm just going to outline that with my number 4 brush and some black. I can even extend that, so just because I'm starting off as an outline does not mean that I have to just continue as an outline. So I'm playing with that idea, but I'm going to go back in here and outline it here. That lets us see how, just what we can get out of our number 4 brush, see what the limitations are, see how it works. And so now I'm going to go back in to this area, and you see I just cleaned my brush off just slightly. I want to make sure that the old value I was working with came out. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to see if I can do a nice little gradient across this heart. I'm going to go from top to bottom because that's the way I have my paper angled. And I'm going to render in the top of this heart with a nice solid black. Render in that top of that heart with a nice solid black. All right, rendering that in. I'm going to wipe a little bit of that off and not really re-dip it. This, I'm filling this and it got too dry. Like you can see even here, the marks that I'm leaving. So I'm just going to use some of my dirty water because it's not going to influence the value too much, and I'm not really concerned entirely with value, but you can sometimes use your dirty water if that's like, and especially in this case because we're only working with the black and the white paint, so it's not going to influence that dark color too much. It won't influence that mid color, it won't influence that, but you definitely want to keep it out of your black and keep it out of your white entirely. So now that that's still wet, I'm just going to go into that edge a little bit with my deeper gray. I'm going to erase that off, and I'm going to wet this a little more. And what the wet into wet does is it allows for a little bit more of a smoother transitions when you work wet into wet, because the paper's already wet and it aids in moving the paint around. It helps with when you want to get atmospheric effects. It's really good that way too, and it's also gives you your painting a much more of a spontaneous look. It will aid in that too. So I'm just going all the way down, and oops, I looked to the side and I got a little bit of that paint outside of the heart. So what I'm going to do is, because I just barely did it, I've wet my paper towel, and I'm just going to go right along there and carefully just dab a little bit of water into there and remove that excess paint from the surface. And that's the best way you can erase when you're working with watercolor. If I wanted to clean these edges up to go all the way out to the edge, I've got a little excess paint there and I can move that out. I can go back in and just lightly place that value that I was working with. Again, working with just a little bit of the excess wet paint there, and finally manipulating it to go out to that edge, that to make the edges a little more crisp and make that, give a little bit more control over a medium that is likes to fight you for control. So again, I went outside of that heart shape a little, and I'm just going to go back in there and dab that off. And then I'm going to go in here in the bottom with just a little bit more water to help that diffuse and give me a really nice diffuse in there. And so you see how nice and soft that diffuse is relative to when we went wet into dry with the other areas. So let's see what I can do with my square brush. Do I want to use it for a space like this? Let's see. So So sure, it works just fine for a space like this. You can get it to move if you can get it to move. This is a really good exercise to start playing around with that idea of seeing what you can get your brushes to do. So yeah, it works just fine this way. I find that the round brushes are the most versatile. So you see I'm cleaning this brush off after I use it, and you want to do that with every brush. Again, going back in and just playing with seeing how you can layer watercolor. If I wanted to go in and I've given this a nice gradient wash, if I want to go in with gray and put in that little middle where the leaves form and then add a little bit of more form to this, I can go in with my brush and add paint on top of paint. I'm going to put this under my hand and again, because that's what I like to do. Yeah, okay. That's a little wet under there, but c'est la vie. I'm not sure. And so just going back in and playing with that, I see that I'm putting down more paint than I'm interested in putting down. So you see how I wiped some of it off. And now I'm just playing with where I'm modeling that leaf. Going in, doing a nice little outline. Rubbing that off, and then just taking that edge and blending it out. And you see how it does a nice little diffuse that way, even though we're working wet into wet. But this also just lets you see, again, how you can work on top of an area that you've already painted. Watercolor really lends itself to completing paintings in layers. So see how nice that is, how nice that can be. You want to add, just because you drew one thing does not mean that you can't embellish it afterwards. Look how nice that is. And since I did that dark outline there, I'm going to go back in with the black just to disguise it in and move that around. And you see, since I didn't add too much paint to my brush, what happened is I got a little bit of immediate wet into wet. This is bleeding over, so you see I washed my brush out. So now I'm just going to go between these two passages, pass my brush over that, and get them to blend out a little bit more that way. And again, get rid of the excess paint on my brush. Keep playing, fill in the blanks. If you guys want to play with one color, give that a whirl. Got my water a little bit dirty. I'm cleaning out my brush again a little more. And I'm going to add this one color in just to play with color just a little. And I'm going to paint in my star a color. Ooh, look at that. All right. So I wonder, since I'm playing with color, I wonder how I can, if I can get more than one value out of my color. And the answer is yes, yes I can. So look at that nice little blend that we can get right there on the spot. And that'll just give you a taste of getting into color when we get into color in a few sessions.